Thank you. Now, Amal Osman, I mean, I know her since birth. We really treat her as like our daughter. My wife sent an apology, but she's looking forward to reading your contribution because she was very much taken by your first contribution in the book, which is upstairs, Women Writers, on the concept of motherhood. Amal, she's very modest about her achievement, but she got first in English at Kent University and got a distinction in University College London in her MA. She's done quite a lot of work in the educational sector. She spent how many years in Egypt?
3 years.
3 years in Egypt, as well as she wrote quite a lot in various mediums, and she was also a part of the team behind I Know Two Sudans, an anthology showcasing creative writing from Sudanese voices. Her work reflects a commitment to language, literacy, and the power of a storyteller. So today, you're talking to us about the time, space, and belonging in a Tayeb Salih work.
Good morning. Thank you all for coming today and being a part of this symposium celebrating one of the greatest Sudanese writers of our time. So, as Ahmed has already introduced me, I'm Amal, and I'm going to be presenting about how time, space, and belonging comes up as themes in Salih's writing. So within this presentation, I really want to be focused on Salih's novel, A Seasonal Migration to the North, and also the short story, The Wedding of Zayn, and how these themes show up within his writing. So I think our first entrance into truly understanding how these three concepts come into play in his writing is that we have to understand what he means by belonging. So the Oxford Review has defined belonging as the emotional connection and the sense of connection that individuals experience within a group, a community, or an organization. And they say that it encompasses feeling valued, respected, and understood for one's unique identity, background, and contributions. And they also state that when an individual feels a strong sense of belonging, they are more likely to engage actively within the community and contribute positively to their environment. So that's a really key point that I want us to keep in mind for the rest of the presentation. I think the point about engaging and contributing positively to an environment is integral to understanding the two words that I'm going to be discussing in the presentation today. I want to drone on particularly about Tayeb Salih's life because I think many of people here already know a lot about him. And I'm sure it's going to be covered thoroughly across the course of the day. But I really do want to highlight that Salih himself has lived a life where he has traversed multiple spaces and times, not only just in Sudan's history, but also in England's as well. And I'm sure that that has pushed him to question this idea of belonging on a personal level, which has then entered into his works really quite clearly. So first, we're going to start with the seasonal migration to the north. I think that belonging in this text is explored through the lens of a post-colonial world. That's nothing new that everyone hasn't heard. I think the book itself is a story within a story. So we have our unnamed narrator, who we hear the story of Mustafa Saeed from. And the narrator maneuvers this space and time in a really significant way, because the story jumps back and forth between the narrator's story and also Mustafa's story. So the fact that the narrator, I think, the fact that he remains unnamed, not only allows for readers to recognize the commonalities between his story and their own, reducing then the individuality of the narrative, but it also allows for a really purposeful mirroring between Mustafa's experience and the narrator's experience of going back and forth between living in the West and living in Sudan. Salih forces his readers to engage with how movement between these spaces and times changes both of these characters within the novel. So the novel itself is riddled with these liminalities and these ambiguities. Both the narrator and Mustafa reveal their challenges in feeling that sense of belonging in the spaces that they occupy. They both can no longer fit in the traditional Sudanese society that they came from, after they've spent time in the West, and they're not able to really feel that sense of ease and belonging when they're in the West. So the opening of the novel is really significant, and I love that Muhammad also mentioned that quotation of the village being situated on the bend of the Nile. So the opening is significant because it kind of foreshadows the sense of unease that we're going to see across the novel. Salih describes the village of Wad Hamid as being situated on the bend of the Nile. And I think that Salih purposefully conceptualizes Wad Hamid as a place that's not fixed, is ever moving, just in the same way that water is, in the same way that the Nile moves through many different countries. I think the novel deliberately starts at this transitional point, and then it introduces this idea of being in limbo from the very beginning. So this idea is not only, it doesn't start off the novel for us, but it also returns again at the end of the novel, with Salih employing this kind of cyclical narrative, using the natural imagery of the river to express the idea of belonging to a landscape. So after Mustafa's tragic end is fully revealed within the novel, the narrator states, "Though floating on the water, I was not a part of it." So I'm a literature nerd, so I really like to do close readings of moments in novels. And I think that this moment, not only it's literally saying that the narrator is separate to the water and to the land, but I think metaphorically, what he's trying to suggest is that the narrator doesn't feel a part of the world that he encompasses. He doesn't feel like he fits in the village or in the landscape of the village. The narrator then continues and says, "Turning to the left and to the right, I found I was halfway between north and south. I was unable to continue and unable to return." This moment not only mirrors the characters going through this transient, unfixed space throughout the novel, but considering the post-colonial context of the novel, I think it's also mirroring the fate of the countries left behind after the colonizing administrations actually left those countries. Because if you think about it, after independence, many countries were left with no roadmap for their futures. They didn't know if they were turning left or right, north or south. I think there were power vacuums, which ultimately led to military dictatorships. And we saw this ourselves in Sudan. And then also there was this ever-growing conflict between the traces of the West's intervention that was left behind, and also this rejuvenated sense of identity and national pride that we found in countries after independence. So this portrayal of liminality captures the essence of colonization as a disease that leaves traces long after the physical presence of that sickness is there. I think Salih deliberately uses this extended metaphor, comparing colonization to a contagion, a disease, to highlight how colonization can affect not just the colonized, but it also affects the colonizer in irrevocable ways. So I think this is made really clear when during Mustafa Saeed's trial, the professor says that Mustafa is the best example of the fact that our civilizing mission in Africa was futile, basically. So he says, after all our efforts we've made to educate you, it's as if you've come out of the jungle for the very first time. Mustafa's response is, it highlights how he understands that the recognition of colonization as a disease, and ultimately he declares his mission of reverse colonization. And he says in the book, "The ships at first sailed down the Nile carrying guns, not bread, and the railways were originally set up to transport troops. The schools were started so as to teach us how to say yes in their language. They imported to us the germ of the greatest European violence, as seen in the Somme and in the Verdun, the like of which the world has never previously known. The germ of a deadly disease that struck them more than 1,000 years ago. Yes, my dear sirs, I am as an invader into your very home, a drop of poison which you have infected into the veins of history. I am no Othello was alive." So this is a bit of a tech issue because I did this on Google Slides. So it's supposed to be around the word germ, but I think that we might often read this moment as Salih or Mustafa Saeed talking about the British colonization as a germ. But I actually think that it goes beyond that and past that. And he's talking about the germ, the original germ, which is the ancient Roman invasion of the British Isles, which is arguably what started this cycle of violence that is colonization that we're still, seeing the effects of today. So these ambiguities continue. When Salih talks about the concept of reverse colonization, we see it really clearly through the character of Mustafa Saeed. So Edward Said typically says that colonization is presented, or colonialism is presented through the inversion of sentiments that are commonly associated with the Orient, and it's being used to refer to those from the Occident. So reverse colonization is when you refer to someone of the Orient using the exact same language that you would typically use for those that you've subjugated. So Mustafa's characterization follows this storyline very clearly. His actions within the novel follow that plot of imperialism. He goes to a foreign country, he does treacherous things of a sexual and emotional nature before he returns to his country of origin, seemingly unscathed. However, I think that this story of reverse colonization is not as clear-cut as presented on the surface. And Jamal Mahjoub, in an article in The Guardian, comments that Salih refuses to settle for a really simplistic denouncement of colonialism, and that in his novel, everything remains uncomfortably ambiguous. This is because Salih not only critiques the colonial violence and its impact on the colonized, clearly through the fact that Mustafa acknowledges he was not immune from the germ of contagion that oozes from the body of the universe, but he also uses Mustafa's infatuation with white women, and the path he chooses to employ this is, his sexual pursuits of white women. He's also showing us that the infatuation with white European culture can be very destructive to someone like Mustafa. I think that Salih reveals that Mustafa's mission of trying to gain liberation and regain the sense of belonging that was stripped by the colonial project through the sexual exploitation of the colonizing powers as ultimately futile because of Mustafa Saeed's tragic death at the end. Mustafa Saeed does not, in fact, come out of the colonizing mission unscathed, as many Western countries seem to have done post-colonization. And I think that this is shown really clearly in the final chapters of the book, particularly once the contents of Mustafa's secret room in his house in Hamid are revealed. And it's a contrast to his own home in England, where he carried out his colonizing mission. So his apartment in London is basically a den for the exotic. So it's filled with paintings and drawings of palm trees along the shores of the Nile, boats with sails like dove wings, suns setting over the mountains of the Red Sea, camel caravans wending their way along the dunes of the borders of the Yemen, boab trees in Kurdistan, naked girls from the tribes of the Zendi, the Nuer, and the Shuluk, fields of banana and coffee on the equator, and then old temples in this district of Nubia, and Arabic books with decorated covers written in ornate Kufic script. So he uses these cultural items and tropes in order to lure British women in for his sexual pursuits, and they act as a means to an end so that he can fulfill his revenge of reverse colonialism. But I pose this important question, then: why does the secret room in his house in Wad Hamid have all the makings of a traditional English drawing room? So the narrator, when he goes and sees this secret room in Wad Hamid, he writes, a fireplace. Imagine it, a real English fireplace with all the bits and pieces. Above it is a brass cowl, and in front of it, quadrangular, tiled in green marble, with a mantelpiece of blue marble. On either side of the fireplace were two Victorian chairs covered in figured silk material, while between them stood a round table with books and notebooks on it. I think everyone who's been to Sudan or knows anything about Sudan, we can all agree that a fireplace is not a necessity, and we are battling with the heat most of the time, and we're not going out of our way to produce more inescapable warmth. So the narrator also mentions that Mustafa had many classic texts from the English canon, with not a single Arabic book, and that it was like a graveyard and a mausoleum, arguably a mausoleum to the British and white European culture that influenced him. If his colonization, or if his colonial revenge was completed, why then does he have this ode to his former life in the West? Why does it exist? I think that the secrecy of this room is significant. I think it suggests that he feels that this side to him is shameful, and that he hasn't come out of the interaction with the West unscathed as we may think. And perhaps even that he values the traces of the West that have been left within him, and that he wanted to share this complicated love with someone who might understand it, our unnamed narrator. So someone who's traversed the same complicated spaces and questions about identity as he has. To finish off my points about this novel, I want to loop back again to that final chapter of the novel and the ambiguous ending. The novel ending in such an ambiguous way is profound because we don't clearly know whose perspective it is from. Is it a flashback to Mustafa's final moments where he chooses life, but the landscape of the Nile swallows him up? Or is it a warning to both our unnamed narrator and us as readers to be weary and to purge ourselves of the traces of cultures that don't belong in our bodies? The river then could be acting as some sort of spiritual and cultural baptism to set us on a path of pursuing our sense of belonging, even if that notion has been challenged thoroughly in the past. The chapter's ambiguous ending reveals that both men have been fractured by their experiences of crossing cultures and navigating the question of belonging. And it highlights the seductive but destructive power of cultural exchange, and leaves us with the question, can one find true belonging after traversing the sharp edges of two different worlds? I'm now going to speak about the wedding of Zayn and the themes and how they show up in this short story. I'm going to let you guys know that it's my favorite piece of Salih. I love it so much. And rereading it ahead of this conference was really a true reminder of why Salih's writing should be treasured amongst us in this community, but also the Afro-Arab community as well. And I just want to start off by saying, though my points about this short story are going to be shorter, it's not an indication of the text being less nuanced, only that I think when it comes to the question of the themes that I'm exploring, it posits a clearer and more linear message than we see in A Seasonal Migration to the North. So the Wedding of Zayn, if you haven't had the pleasure of reading it yet, also has the same quality of being this non-linear narrative because it jumps back and forth in time to reveal the story of Zayn, the beloved village fool. So Zayn is a character that is born and raised in the village and is undeniably loved by his people, but is definitely not presented as the most responsible man because of his carefree, charismatic, and clownish nature. So as the story progresses, we learn that Zayn's declarations of love to various young women in the village acts as a signal to other young men in the village of a girl's eligibility for marriage and her beauty. So no sooner does Zayn declare his love for a girl that she's married off to the next well-to-do bachelor from the village. The story unfolds with us being drip-dropped this information about Zayn's impending nuptials to the most sought-after and most beautiful woman in the village, Ni'ma. And we piece together the character of Zayn through the perspective of others and his interactions with his fellow villagers. The story ends on Zayn's marriage to Ni'ma, which is celebrated by all. So Zayn, I want to say, my first point about this short story is that he is presented as a unifying force within the village. And there's a clear portrayal of how the power of community and how the village functions as a space that holds and performs tradition for Zayn and the rest of the people in the village. So prior to Zayn's marriage to Ni'ma, he's presented as a village clown that declares his love to others, and it's not returned. But ultimately, he's never presented as bitter about ending up without a wife. So the importance of Zayn's characterization is the fact that he is presented as this unifying force within the village, rather than one of separation, as we see in Mustafa Saeed's story. Zayn unifies the different strata of Sudanese society within the novel. At one point, one of his sweethearts is a girl from the Bedouins who lives at the outskirts of the Nile in the north of Sudan. And some of these Arabs are, of course, who do not marry native people as they consider them pure Arabs, and the local people consider them as rough Bedouins. But Zayn broke that barrier. I think Salih describes that. He writes about Zayn that in a conservative society where girls were hidden away from young men, Zayn becomes an emissary for love, transporting its sweet fragrance from place to place. So then acts as a person that bridges divides between different tribes and different communities within this wider village that he belongs to. This goes even further beyond his love interests. It's not only the case when it comes to his love interests, but Zayn also is described as having friendships with people who would typically be marginalized in society because of disabilities or because of their ethnicity. So Salih writes that Zayn had numerous friendships of this sort with persons whom the villagers regarded as abnormal, such as deaf Ishmana or Musa the Lame, or the Bakhit who was born deformed with no upper lip and a paralyzed left side. Zayn thus not only belongs wholly to the village, but he's also a force that positively contributes to the village. And he helps those that may not traditionally feel like they belong start to feel that sense of belonging and acceptance. For his positive contributions to his society, he is widely celebrated. And for his wedding, it is written that people from upriver and people came from downriver, and that the Kors, the Bedouin, flocked to his feast, and that the Talha people came to the very last man. So I think the listing of these different groups coming together to celebrate this one man emphasizes that he is a unifier within his village. The next point I want to make about Zayn is that he is considered, I think, the epitome of what true belonging would look like in a space. So thinking back to the definition of belonging by the Oxford Review that I mentioned at the beginning, his quirks and his clownish behavior is wholly celebrated throughout the village. Salih writes that the villagers were infected by him and that everyone would burst into loud reverberating guffaws in response to Zayn's own laughter, and that his laughter had become part of the village ever since Zayn was born. So I think Salih writes Zayn as a character almost as if he was embedded into the folds of the village itself, just in the same way that we'd hear the birds chirping at Fajr, this sound of a sport in the morning, or the chatter of village women in their homes prior to some kind of village function that's happening. I think when Zayn also is nearby, one key piece that tells us that he is this epitome of belonging is the fact that the village women flock to him. And, you know, if you were here for the previous conference, I talk a lot about women and how they conceptualize the landscape and how mothers are key to understanding the love of the space that you incorporate. So I think that the women flocking to him and being amused by their raillery shows us that Zayn's relationship to his community is that of adoration and acceptance of him in his entirety. So from his foolish, mischievous actions to his unconventional declarations of love that is shown, that tells people what a good marriage is like, he is loved. The multiple humiliations by all women across the village highlights that his triumphs and his successes were celebrated by his people, and there was not a single woman who did not humiliate at his wedding. Last but not least, my final point about the wedding of Zayn is that Zayn is presented as a force of prosperity within the village. So Salih uses the altercation between Zayn and Sif ad-Din to reveal this. In case you guys don't know, Sif ad-Din is described as this village drunkard who has brought shame to his father and to the family and has ultimately been ostracized by the community as a result of his negative impact on the community. So though the fight between Zayn and Sif is presented as volatile, this moment of conflict between them ultimately impacts Sif and is a catalyst to his transformation to be a good moral citizen of the village. The villagers also expressed that the prosperity was brought to the village after this physical fight, when Abdul Samad retrospectively speculates that it was all because of Zayn. So we're shown another way in which Zayn actively contributes positively to his environment and how he's defined and how he incorporates that definition from the Oxford Review about how he is a positive force within his environment constantly. So just to conclude, I think that, you know, the concept of time, space and belonging has been outlined in both of his works, but in very different ways. And I just want to thank you for your ears, and I look forward to hearing the rest of the presentations from the speakers and discussions about your personal interpretations of these texts.
Thank you very much indeed.